and welcome to your next screencast on taxonomy. Now, taxonomy is how we as scientists name things. So when we talk about classification, we talk about taxonomy. So first off, before we even start talking about how we're going to name it, we want to talk about the species that are on Earth. Now, if you look all around you, even just in your house, you may find a dog, you might find a plant, you have yourselves, you might have a cat, a fish. So we have all kinds of species all throughout the world. And remember, species are not just animals. Species are more than just animals. They can be the bacteria that live in your gut. They can be the insects that fly around. They can be the mushrooms or fungus that is growing. They can be all kinds of things. So we are talking about all types of organisms that are living. Now, how many species are there? Well, as a scientist, we don't actually answer this question. It's a pretty hard question, actually. This is what we say, though. 1.8 million species have been named, but scientists estimate there are 10 million species on Earth. So that's still a lot of species. So think about that. If we have about 1.8, that means we have 8.2 species that have remained unnamed. Now, if you're thinking that this is animals, most vertebrates have been named. We think about 90% of vertebrates have been named. When you think about insects, think how tiny those guys are. Think how they might look like each other. We think we haven't named about 90%. So the exact opposite. So let's move on. Okay, so that is a lot of species. And it would be hard to keep track of all these animals without specific naming systems. So this is where taxonomy comes into play. We've been naming animals for thousands of years, but we have only used the system which we name called the Linnaean system for about 200 years. So it's a lot younger than any other naming system we've ever used. So the naming of an organism and putting it into classification is called taxonomy. Now this is different than taxidermy, so don't get confused. Taxonomy is the classification of an animal. Taxidermy is where you're taking an animal and that has previously died and you're stuffing it so you can look at it for studying purposes. So the first person that we want to talk about is the Greek philosopher Aristotle. He was the first person to classify things. Now remember I said we've been classifying things for thousands of years. So we've been classifying things for a long, long time. But he basically classified by very, very broad, simple terms. So he said animals that had blood, animals that didn't. Animals that had a spine, animals that didn't. And this wasn't actually a very good way of naming things because we have so many animals, we have so many plants, we have all of that. And it would have been hard to start keeping track based on these very broad, simple terms. So what happened was eventually, in Western science, a botanist named Carolus Linnaeus began classifying by his own classification system. Now we pretty much use this classification system still today. He was the guy about 200 years ago that came up with this. And this classification started very broad and became more specific further down the line. Now, you might be asking yourself, so if it's very broad, why didn't we stay with Aristotle? Well, the reason was he became very specific, and the way he classified things let us know how closely related things were. So, let's go ahead and move on. But this is what Linnaeus did. Linnaeus used a system that included taxons, or units of measure, and you might have heard of this before. Those taxons would be your kingdom, your phylum, your class, your order, your family, your genus, and your species. Now, that first taxon, the kingdom, is very, very broad, and we get more specific as we go down until we get to the species. And remember, at the species level, you can only have one certain organism. You can't have 5, 6, 7. You can't even have 300. You can't even have 2. So the species is very, very, very specific as to what the organism is. And this is why this worked very well for us, because we could see how closely related things were by just looking at their name. looking at their full name. Now, when we talk about things, we only use the genus and the species. So we still use this classification system, and we call it the Linnaean system. We named it after Carolus Linnaeus, who founded it. And in the past years, there have been changes to the Linnaean system based on evolutionary history. So basically what that means is we've changed some of the names because we've found, due to DNA, due to other evidence for evolution, that there was a better name or it fit in a better category. The most recent example of this is in 1990, we actually added a taxon. So we found that there were more differences than originally thought prior to the years through DNA evidence. And what we did is, remember, we studied that DNA. We looked at that DNA. And we saw how different things were. And when we saw that, we thought, this classification system needs another level so we can take into account what has happened. So when we take into account what has happened, we added a domain. Now, a domain is still a very, very, very broad term, and it actually has to do more with the cells. So we have domain eukarya, and domain eukarya has to do with whether or not it's a eukaryotic cell. We also have domain archaebacteria and domain bacteria, and those are two levels of prokaryotes or bacteria. And archae, meaning old, just means that we have older, more primitive bacteria than some of the newer bacteria. And remember, we're developing that through evolution. So when we talk about that, our new naming system now has domain in that. So we have domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. It hasn't changed a whole lot, but it has changed. So what I want you to do is write an acronym for it. Find a way to remember it, because you are going to need to know this domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And if you write it, it's going to be more inherent to you, and so you're going to know it better. So go ahead and write that down on your paper. Pause for a second to think about that. Okay, our next thing. So we've been talking about how it's very, very specific at the bottom and not so specific, but it's actually very broad at the top. So if you look at this picture, look at the kingdom. The kingdom is Animalia, so that means we have all kinds of different animals in this kingdom. And we have a grizzly bear, we have a black bear, we have a giant panda, a red fox, a squirrel, a snake, and a sea star. Now, one thing you may notice about most of these is that they all have backbones. So when we go down to phylum Chordata, or our phylum, everything that has a backbone stays. So that sea star is now out of the picture because we are to the point where we have backbones, or we are only looking at vertebrates. Now if we go down another class, we're only looking at mammals. So we lost the reptile, the coral snake. And as we go down even further, we're looking at only carnivores. Remember, carnivores are what eat meat. So the squirrel is then taken out. Now we get down to the family. And the family Ursidae, what that means is more bear type things. So we have the family Ursidae, and we have the black bear, and we have what looks to be a grizzly bear. So, and as we go down even further, we get to Ursus arctos. So the grizzly bear, in his full naming, we would say kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Animalia, order Carnivora, family Ursidae, genus is Ursus, and species is Arctos. Now, we generally talk about the genus and species together, so we would say Ursus arctos. Now, there's a certain way we write out all of this classification, and if you notice, based on the last slide, they were all in a different language. Well, that language is Latin. So when we refer to a species, we only use their genus and their species. We don't write out the entire classification. Now, we do use that entire classification for purposes of knowing how closely related animals, plants, everything is. So to write this out, we write out the genus and then the species. The genus is capitalized. The species is not. Everything is italicized, and we generally write it in Latin. So our example before was Ursus arctos. As you can see, I capitalized the genus. The species is not capitalized, and it is italicized, and that is in Latin. What we call this Ursus arctos, or the genus and the species together, is a binomial. So we generally write out the binomial. We do not write out the whole entire name. Okay, so let's move on. So we use taxonomy to create relationships or to figure out relationships between different organisms. So since we have based it on evolution, we can use it to determine how closely related different animals are. For example, your dog is Canis lupus familiaris. Now, this species actually has two names for its species, and it has one genus. So the Canis is the one genus. And a wolf, a wild wolf, is Canis lupus. Meaning, if we look at this, it is very, very similar. The Canis is the same, the lupus is the same. The thing that changes is the familiaris. So this means dogs and wolves are very closely related, and we can tell just looking at their binomial name. Now, for other animals that aren't as closely related, like in our example of the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, what you can do is you can look at the family, you can look at the phylum, you can look at any taxon that you want to. And if it is the same name as another animal or another organism, that's where they are related. So remember, we had the coral snake, which was in the family Chordata, or in the phylum Chordata, and it was knocked out when we started talking about mammals. So we can see how closely related they are based on that. Okay, this is all we have for today. Go ahead and take your notes, write them down, and we will talk about it more in class. Thanks so much.